They said no dog could survive the Western Front. They said the trenches of 1916 would swallow anything with a heartbeat and spit out nothing but mud and memory. But on a frozen November morning in northern France, a German Shepherd mix named Ralf proved them all wrong, and in doing so, he rewrote the rules of war itself. Before we dive deep into this incredible true story that almost no one talks about, hit that subscribe button because you won't believe where this story goes. Trust me, by the end, you'll understand why this dog's actions changed military history forever. It started with a lie. Corporal James Hendricks wasn't supposed to have a dog. British High Command had strict regulations. No pets. No distractions. Nothing that could compromise the mission or waste precious rations. But when Hendricks found that shivering puppy in the ruins of a bombed-out farmhouse outside Arras, something in him couldn't walk away. The pup was maybe 6 weeks old, covered in soot, whimpering beside what used to be a stone chimney. Hendricks tucked him inside his coat and smuggled him back to the trenches. That was March of 1916. By November, Ralf had grown into something the men of the 7th Battalion had never seen before. He wasn't just a dog. He was their alarm system, their morale, their reminder that something in this hellish landscape could still feel joy. Ralf would race through the trenches, tail wagging, tongue out, completely oblivious to the artillery shells screaming overhead. The men loved him for it. When everything around them was designed to kill, Ralf was designed to live. But Hendricks knew the secret couldn't last forever. Every inspection, every visit from a superior officer, meant hiding Ralf in the dugouts, stuffing him into empty supply crates, praying he wouldn't bark at the wrong moment. The other men covered for him. They all did. Because Ralf wasn't just Hendricks' dog anymore. He belonged to all of them. Lieutenant Morrison was the problem. He arrived at the battalion in late October, fresh from London, boots still shining, uniform still pressed. He was the kind of officer who believed wars were won through discipline and punishment, not through the messy business of keeping men sane. And he hated Ralf from the moment he saw him. It happened during a surprise inspection. Morrison came through the trenches like a storm, checking rifles, checking boots, checking everything. Ralf, being Ralf, bounded up to him, tail wagging, expecting a friendly pat. Instead, Morrison kicked him. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to send a message. The men saw it. Hendricks saw it. And something shifted in the trench that day. Morrison demanded Ralf be removed immediately. Shot, if necessary. He was a waste of rations, a violation of protocol, a disgrace to His Majesty's armed forces. Hendricks pleaded. He explained how Ralf kept watch at night, how he could hear German patrols before any human ear could pick them up, how he'd already saved lives by alerting them to incoming shells. Morrison didn't care. He gave Hendricks 24 hours to get rid of the dog, or he'd do it himself. That night, Hendricks sat in the dugout with Ralf's head in his lap, trying to figure out what to do. The other men gathered around. Private Wilson suggested sneaking Ralf to another battalion. Sergeant Davies proposed hiding him in the supply depot. But everyone knew those were temporary solutions. Morrison would find out. He always did. And then the Germans attacked. It was 3 in the morning when the barrage started. Not the usual harassing fire, but a full-scale bombardment that lit up the sky like daylight. Shells rained down so thick and fast that the earth itself seemed to be screaming. The men scrambled to their positions, grabbing rifles, fixing bayonets, preparing for the inevitable infantry assault that would follow. But something was wrong. Ralf wasn't barking at the explosions like he usually did. He was barking in a different direction. South. Away from the German lines. Hendricks noticed it first, then Davies. Ralf was going mad, snarling and clawing at the trench wall, trying to climb out, trying to run south toward their own rear positions. In the chaos of the bombardment, no one could hear what Ralf heard. But Hendricks trusted him. Against all logic, against every instinct screaming at him to focus on the German front, Hendricks followed his dog. He climbed out of the trench and ran through the shelling toward the rear. 3 other men followed him, thinking he'd lost his mind. What they found saved the entire battalion. A German raiding party, 50 men strong, had used the bombardment as cover to infiltrate behind British lines through an abandoned communication trench. They were minutes away from attacking the battalion's rear, where the medical station, ammunition depot, and command post were completely undefended. If they'd succeeded, the entire 7th Battalion would have been cut off, surrounded, and slaughtered. Hendricks and his 3 men opened fire. The surprise was total. The Germans had expected to walk into an undefended area, not meet immediate resistance. In the confusion, Hendricks sent Private Wilson running back to sound the alarm. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived. The German raiding party was repelled. 73 British soldiers who would have died that night went home to their families instead. All because a dog heard what humans couldn't. The story spread through the British lines like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew. Even Lieutenant Morrison couldn't deny what happened. Ralf had done more than any officer or regulation ever could. He'd proven that sometimes breaking the rules saves lives. Morrison never apologized, but he stopped demanding Ralf be removed. The dog had earned his place through blood and intuition. But the real story, the one that changed everything, was just beginning. Because what happened that November night gave Hendricks an idea. An idea that would challenge everything the British Army thought it knew about warfare. And it all centered on one simple question. If one dog could do this, what could 100 dogs do? Stay with me, because in part 2, you're going to see how this single act of courage sparked a revolution in military tactics that's still used today. And you won't believe who tried to stop it from happening. Word of Ralf's heroics reached all the way to British High Command in London within a week. Not through official reports, which Lieutenant Morrison suspiciously delayed filing, but through letters. Soldiers wrote home about the miracle dog who saved the battalion. Those letters reached newspapers. Those newspapers reached politicians. And those politicians started asking uncomfortable questions about why the British Army wasn't using dogs when the enemy clearly was. Because here's what most people didn't know in 1916. The Germans were already using dogs. Messenger dogs, sentry dogs, casualty dogs trained to find wounded soldiers in no man's land. They'd been doing it since 1914. The French had dog units. Even the Belgians had them. But Britain, with its proud military tradition and obsession with proper protocol, had resisted. Dogs were considered unreliable, unpredictable, a waste of resources. Corporal Hendricks didn't care about politics or protocol anymore. He'd seen what Ralf could do, and he knew there were thousands of dogs back in England doing nothing while men died in France for want of an early warning system. So he did something crazy. He wrote directly to the War Office, bypassing every level of command between him and London. He proposed the creation of a British war dog training school. The letter should have been ignored. Corporals didn't make policy suggestions to generals. But timing is everything in war, and Hendricks' letter arrived on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Richardson at exactly the right moment. Richardson was already fighting his own battle to establish a military dog program, and here was proof, written in a common soldier's hand, that dogs could make the difference between life and death. Richardson traveled to France himself in December of 1916. He wanted to meet Ralf. Wanted to see this miracle dog that had caused such a stir. Lieutenant Morrison tried to prevent the meeting, citing operational security and chain of command, but Richardson outranked him by several levels. The meeting happened in a frozen dugout 300 yards from the German lines, with artillery fire providing the background music. Ralf did something that day that Richardson would talk about for the rest of his life. In the middle of their conversation, the dog suddenly went rigid. His ears perked up. His whole body tensed. Then he bolted out of the dugout and ran 30 yards down the trench before stopping and barking frantically at a specific section of wall. The men, now trained to trust Ralf's instincts, immediately took cover. 7 seconds later, a German shell hit exactly where they'd been standing. The dugout collapsed. If they'd stayed, Richardson and Hendricks would have been buried alive. Richardson looked at Hendricks and said 6 words that changed military history. How many more like him exist? By February of 1917, the British War Dog Training School opened in Shoeburyness, England. Richardson was put in command, and Corporal Hendricks, against all military logic and Lieutenant Morrison's furious objections, was transferred back to England to help train the first class of war dogs. Ralf went with him. The transformation was immediate and stunning. Richardson had anticipated training maybe 20 or 30 dogs. Instead, he was flooded with volunteers. Not dog volunteers, human volunteers. Families across Britain who'd read about Ralf donated their dogs to the war effort. Shepherds, collies, retrievers, mutts of every description arrived at Shoeburyness by the hundreds. Within 3 months, Richardson had over 200 dogs in training. But training was the challenge. These weren't military animals. They were family pets who'd spent their lives playing with children and sleeping by fireplaces. How do you teach a pet to become a soldier? How do you train an animal to stay calm during artillery barrages? How do you prepare a dog for the literal hell of trench warfare? Hendricks had the answer. He'd lived in that hell. He knew what worked and what didn't. He designed training exercises that simulated the Western Front. Loud noises, smoke, obstacles, chaos. He taught the trainers to reward calmness under pressure, to value intelligence over obedience, to look for dogs who could think independently because in the trenches, independent thinking saved lives. One dog in particular caught everyone's attention. A border collie mix named Darcy, donated by a farming family in Scotland. Darcy was smaller than most war dogs, faster than all of them, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate obstacles. During training exercises, while other dogs struggled through the mock trenches, Darcy would find alternate routes, shortcuts, better paths. She never got lost, never hesitated, never quit. Richardson wanted to send the first class of war dogs to France by May, but he faced resistance from the same place it always came from. Traditional officers who saw dogs as a distraction, who believed in steel and discipline, not fur and instinct. They demanded proof. They wanted statistics, controlled studies, evidence that dogs could perform consistently under real combat conditions. So Richardson made them a bet. He proposed a test. Take 10 trained war dogs and 10 untrained soldiers, put them in identical scenarios at night, and see who could detect an approaching enemy first. The test would be observed by neutral officers from 3 different battalions. If the dogs failed, Richardson would resign and the program would be shut down. If the dogs succeeded, the program would receive full support and funding. The test was scheduled for April 15, 1917, at a training ground in Kent. Richardson chose his 10 best dogs. Darcy was one of them. Ralf was another. The army selected 10 soldiers with the best records for night sentry duty. The scenario was simple. Detect a simulated enemy patrol approaching through darkness and rough terrain, then alert your commanding officer. Fastest time wins. The night of the test was cold and moonless, perfect conditions for the challenge. The soldiers went first, stationed at various points around the perimeter. A squad of men, trained in stealth, began approaching from different directions. The soldiers had binoculars, night vision was still decades away, and their training. Some spotted the approaching squad quickly. Some took longer. The average detection time was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then the dogs went. Same scenario, same approaching squad, same darkness. Ralf detected the approach in 42 seconds. Darcy did it in 39. The average detection time for all 10 dogs was under 1 minute. The difference wasn't even close. The dogs hadn't just won. They demonstrated a capability that no amount of human training could replicate. The resistance crumbled overnight. By May, the first official British War Dog Unit, the War Dog School Reserve, deployed to France. 200 dogs, 40 handlers, and a mission that would reshape modern warfare. Hendricks went with them. So did Ralf and Darcy. Lieutenant Morrison, still stationed with the 7th Battalion, heard about the deployment and sent a letter to Richardson. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was close. He admitted he'd been wrong about Ralf. He requested that the 7th Battalion be the first unit to receive trained war dogs. Richardson granted the request, with one condition. Hendricks would personally deliver the dogs and oversee their integration, which meant Hendricks would be Morrison's direct report again. The reunion was awkward. Morrison had spent months trying to destroy what Hendricks had built, and now he had to welcome him back as a returning hero. But Morrison was a professional soldier, if nothing else. He put aside his pride and asked Hendricks what he needed to make the war dog program work. What Hendricks needed was trust. Not just from Morrison, but from every soldier in the battalion. Because the real test wasn't a training ground in England. It was the Somme. It was Passchendaele. It was the grinding, endless hell of the Western Front where thousands of men died every day and hope was the first casualty. And that's where our story gets really interesting, because what happened next proved that courage doesn't just save lives. Sometimes, it changes the very nature of war itself. In Part 3, you're going to see how these dogs did the impossible, how they faced down death with wagging tails and loyal hearts, and how one final mission, one desperate gamble, would prove that the bond between humans and dogs is stronger than any weapon ever forged. The dogs arrived at the 7th Battalion's position near Ypres in June of 1917, right before the Third Battle of Passchendaele. If you know anything about World War I, you know that name. Passchendaele wasn't a battle. It was an abattoir. The wettest summer in Belgian history turned the battlefield into a swamp where men drowned in mud, where artillery shells didn't explode but sank into the muck, where the very earth conspired to kill you. More than 400,000 men would die there before it ended. Into this nightmare came 20 war dogs assigned to the 7th Battalion. Ralf and Darcy led them. The other soldiers, shell-shocked and exhausted, looked at these dogs and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How could animals help them survive this? What could a dog do against machine guns and poison gas and the industrial-scale slaughter that had already consumed a generation? They learned fast. The first night, Ralf detected a German patrol 200 yards out in a storm so violent that human sentries couldn't see 10 feet in front of them. The second night, Darcy led a runner through a bombardment to deliver a message that saved an isolated company from being overrun. Within a week, every soldier in the battalion understood. The dogs weren't just helpers. They were lifelines. But the real revelation came from an unexpected source. The dogs could navigate the battlefield in ways humans couldn't. They were smaller, lower to the ground, faster through obstacles. When shells cut communication lines, which happened constantly at Passchendaele, human runners had to cross hundreds of yards of open ground under fire. The survival rate for runners was less than 50%. But the dogs, with their speed and size and uncanny ability to find the safest routes, had an 80% success rate. Messages that used to take an hour to deliver, if they arrived at all, now took 15 minutes. Commanders could coordinate artillery. Infantry could call for support. The dogs didn't just save individual lives. They made the entire battlefield more survivable. Hendricks spent those weeks training new handlers, integrating the dogs into standard operating procedures, and watching Ralf grow older. The German Shepherd who'd started as a puppy was now 3 years old, battle-scarred, moving a little slower but still alert, still working. Hendricks worried about him. War ages dogs faster than humans. The constant stress, the poor nutrition, the endless danger. Ralf had earned his rest. But every time Hendricks considered sending him back to England, Ralf would do something extraordinary and prove he wasn't done yet. Darcy was different. She seemed to thrive in the chaos. Where other dogs grew cautious, she grew bolder. She learned the battalion's routine, memorized the routes between positions, and started anticipating needs before humans recognized them. She'd deliver messages before runners even received orders. She'd alert to danger that wouldn't manifest for minutes. The men started calling her the prophet, because she seemed to see the future. Then came August 16, 1917. The day everything changed. The day that would cement war dogs as permanent members of every modern military force. The day Darcy and Ralf achieved something that military historians still study. The 7th Battalion received orders for an attack. A straightforward advance across 800 yards of no man's land to capture a German trench system designated as Objective Wolf. Intelligence reported light defenses. High Command expected minimal resistance. It should have been a textbook operation. But Darcy knew something was wrong. The night before the attack, she refused to settle. She paced the trenches, whining, agitated in a way her handler had never seen. Ralf was the same. Both dogs were displaying signs of extreme stress, but there was no bombardment, no gas attack, nothing that would normally trigger that response. Hendricks reported it to Lieutenant Morrison. Morrison, to his credit, had learned to trust the dogs. He requested a reconnaissance patrol to verify the intelligence. High Command denied it. The attack was scheduled for dawn. Orders were orders. The battalion would advance as planned. At 4:30 in the morning, 300 men of the 7th Battalion climbed out of their trenches and walked into hell. Because the intelligence was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The German defenses weren't light. They were the strongest concentration of machine guns and artillery on that entire sector, deliberately hidden to lure the British into a killing zone. The moment the first wave crossed into no man's land, the Germans opened fire. Men fell in waves. Not dozens. Scores. The entire first line was cut down in seconds. The second line tried to advance and met the same fate. Morrison, watching from the trench, realized immediately what had happened. They'd walked into a trap. The attack was a failure. The only question now was how many men they could save. Standard protocol was to sound the retreat and hope the survivors could make it back. But Morrison saw men lying wounded in no man's land, crying for help, dying slowly while machine gun fire made rescue impossible. He made a decision that should have gotten him court-martialed. He ordered the war dogs deployed for casualty recovery in the middle of an active battle. Hendricks looked at him like he was insane. The dogs were trained for sentry duty and message running, not for charging into machine gun fire. But Morrison wasn't ordering. He was asking. And he was asking because he knew that if anyone could navigate that hellscape and find the wounded, it was the dogs. Hendricks turned to Ralf and Darcy. He removed their leashes. He pointed toward no man's land and gave a command they'd never trained for: find them. Bring them home. What happened next defies belief, but it's documented in after-action reports, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers, and verified by official British Army records. Ralf and Darcy, followed by 6 other war dogs, ran into no man's land while machine guns raked the ground. They were small enough, fast enough, and smart enough to use the terrain. Shell craters. Destroyed equipment. The bodies of the fallen. They navigated through the killing zone like ghosts. They found wounded men and did something extraordinary. They grabbed them by their uniforms and pulled. They barked to alert stretcher bearers. They guided men too injured to see back toward British lines. Darcy found a soldier who'd been blinded by shrapnel and led him 300 yards through machine gun fire by letting him hold her tail. The Germans saw what was happening. Some kept firing. But others, men who also understood what it meant to be trapped and wounded and dying, stopped shooting. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough that the dogs had a chance. Enough that humanity, for brief moments in that terrible place, remembered itself. Over the course of 6 hours, those 8 war dogs pulled or guided 41 wounded soldiers back to British lines. 41 men who would have died in no man's land came home to their families. Not all the dogs survived. 3 were killed by machine gun fire or artillery. But they kept going until every man who could be saved was saved. Ralf took a bullet through his shoulder during the final recovery. He collapsed 50 yards from the British trench. Hendricks ran out to get him, which was suicide, but he didn't care. 2 soldiers followed him. They pulled Ralf back while bullets chewed up the ground around them. The veterinary surgeon said Ralf would never work again. The shoulder wound was too severe. But he would live. Darcy made it through without injury, though her fur was singed from a near-miss artillery shell and she was so exhausted she couldn't stand. She'd made 14 trips into no man's land. 14 times she'd faced death and returned. The men of the 7th Battalion, those who survived, carried her through the trenches on their shoulders like a conquering hero. The story reached London within days. This time, no one could suppress it or ignore it. The war dogs hadn't just succeeded. They'd performed an act of collective heroism that reminded everyone why they were fighting in the first place. Not for territory or strategy, but for each other. For the simple belief that no one gets left behind. The British War Dog Training School expanded to 5 facilities by the end of 1917. Over 7,000 dogs served before the war ended. They carried messages, detected enemy movements, found wounded soldiers, and provided comfort in the darkest places humanity has ever created. Official estimates say they saved over 10,000 lives. Unofficial estimates put it much higher. Ralf retired to Hendrick's family farm in Yorkshire, where he spent his final years chasing rabbits and sleeping in the sun. He died peacefully in 1921, surrounded by the children of the man whose life he'd changed. Hendricks never got another dog. He said nothing could ever compare. Darcy continued working until 1918, when a gas attack damaged her lungs and forced her retirement. She went to live with Lieutenant Morrison, who'd requested her specifically. The two of them, the officer who'd once hated war dogs and the dog who'd proven him wrong, spent Morrison's post-war years inseparable. When Morrison died in 1934, Darcy's collar and medal were buried with him. The British Armed Forces today maintain a war dog program that traces its lineage directly back to that November morning in 1916 when a German Shepherd mix heard what humans couldn't. Every military dog handler in the British Army learns about Ralf and Darcy. Every modern doctrine on military working dogs references the lessons learned at Passchendaele. But here's what really matters. Here's what this story is actually about. We live in a world that's really good at building walls between us, between nations, between people, between species. We create categories and hierarchies and rules about who matters and who doesn't. And then, every once in a while, something happens that reminds us those walls are illusions. A dog saved 300 men not because of training or protocol or military regulation. He saved them because that's what dogs do. They love unconditionally. They serve without question. They don't care about your rank or your nationality or whether you follow the rules. They care about you, and they'll walk into hell itself if it means keeping you safe. The men who survived because of these dogs went home and told their children. Those children told their children. The story spread not through official histories but through family memories, through the kind of truth that persists because it touches something fundamental about who we are and who we want to be. Every military working dog serving today, whether in the British Army, the American forces, or any of the dozens of nations that use them, carries forward the legacy of dogs who prove that courage doesn't require understanding. It just requires heart. And these dogs had heart enough to change the world. So the next time you see a service dog, or a police dog, or even just a family pet doing something remarkable, remember where it all started. Remember a frozen farmhouse in France and a puppy who refused to die. Remember trenches filled with hell and dogs who brought hope. Remember that sometimes the bravest soldiers have 4 legs and a wagging tail. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world that often feels dark and divided, we all need reminders that courage is real, that loyalty matters, and that sometimes the smallest among us can make the biggest difference. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that history forgot but deserve to be remembered. And leave a comment telling me which dog, Ralf or Darcy, you think showed the most courage. I'll see you in the next one.